introduction. I'm glad to be here. Very appreciative of the opportunity to speak to you. But we can't start without talking about the racial justice reform that we are going through in our country right now. And I want to just talk about how CLR educators respond in situations like this, because it's important that we see the connection between our work, which I consider to be very narrow and very specific, to the broader picture around race, around systemic racism, around police brutality, and the specific murder of George Floyd, which sparked this, but in addition to all the other murders that have occurred, including Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, and so on and so on, unfortunately. So with that said, I'm going to share with you our connection with race. And we were using an acronym where we're trying to push people to have an experience or experiences and not just do events. And we're using the acronym of RACE, reflect, acknowledge, call to action, and educate. And these are 4 experiences that have been curated. And as a CLR educator, I'm asking you to participate in these 4 experiences, regardless of where you are in terms of your cultural responsiveness. And I'll tell you more about the exact experiences. First, though, I want to establish that there was a before George Floyd way of looking at CLR, and there's an after George Floyd. And the big difference is the level that we need to be way more explicit because what has occurred in our country. And so I want you to know that before George Floyd, that we did not intentionally focus on race and culture because we wanted to not conflate the topic and keep culture separate, especially from the lens of anthropology. This was intentional on our part because we felt like it should be 2 separate conversations. There's always, though, been a connection between race and culture within CLR, but it's always been implied. And you heard it, if you were paying attention, you heard it through my sessions when I said things like, there are no racists here. When I talked about Blumenbach, when I said that there is no ring of culture about race, because we always focus on culture. So those were always implied statements that I would make throughout the training. And if you were with me, you got those implied connections. And I can go through all of my trainings and I can point out to you exactly where I'm making that connection, but it's implied, right? And those who get it, when I say get it, I'm talking about CLR, they will see the implied connection. Those who don't get it, though, they don't see it. And we evidence this by indicators. And what I hear from people sometimes who don't get it, they'll say, yes, I'm not a racist. He's right. I told you I wasn't a racist. That's an indication they don't get it. Sometimes I would hear people say that race is everything and he doesn't talk about race enough and this is all about race. To me, that's another indicator that they didn't get it. And again, what they're not getting is the implied connection. But the murder of George Floyd has caused us all to make a change, all to do something different, and to do something different in a way that moves us out of our comfort zone. And that includes me. So after the murder of George Floyd, we're going to make things very explicit, right? And we have to show the connections to people where race and culture sort of cross over, which they do cross over in terms of institutional racism, right? And so I'm going to change my wording. I'm going to say, I know there are no racists in here because there better not be, because if you're a racist, you don't belong in cultural responsiveness. I'm going to specifically talk about being anti-racist versus non-racist. When I talk about Blumenbach, I'm going to say that Blumenbach is really, if you follow Blumenbach, it is really unknowingly a subscription to white supremacy, because that's what the concept is based on. It's based on a white supremacist concept. So I don't say that, I haven't been saying that explicitly, but I will going forward. And I will point out that when you link race to culture, you really are thinking like a racist, which I did already say, but I'm going to be more emphatic about it. So we have to see the connection between race and culture because that's part of becoming anti-racist. We non-racist is unacceptable anymore. Non-racist, it's always been necessary but not sufficient. But now, because of what this reformation we're going through, it is unacceptable. And so the question I want you to ask yourself is this: how am I becoming and showing and demonstrating that I am anti-racist? Because non-racist is not acceptable anymore. And we're going to help you do that now through our work. It's going to be an explicit part of our work. You see, there's a big difference between what we're experiencing with George Floyd versus what we're experiencing in other ways. George Floyd is obvious. It was obviously wrong. It was obviously racist. It was obviously a horrific act. We saw a man murdered on television for 9 minutes. We saw him actually die, basically, because he never woke up again. He never came to conscious. So who among you, who among us, who among your family, who among the people you hang around with would look at that situation and say they're okay with that? Or would try to give an explanation, or would try to, in essence, absolve the 4 cops who killed George Floyd? I guarantee you no one, maybe 1 or 2. So for me, the murder of George Floyd speaks to the obvious when it comes to race. As culturally responsive educators, though, we must be aware of the less obvious. And the less obvious is Amy Cooper. You see, Amy Cooper incident occurred a few days before George Floyd, and I would say it was a foreshadowing of what was to come. Amy Cooper, if you haven't seen the footage, please look it up. But she was in Central Park walking her dog, out with her dog, but the dog wasn't leashed. She got asked by an African-American gentleman who's a bird watcher to leash her dog because she was in a bird watching area of Central Park. She proceeded then to leverage her Caucasianness, to leverage her whiteness, and to leverage her fear of African-American men by getting on the phone, dialing 911 and telling the police that she was being threatened by African-American gentlemen. And you have to watch the footage because she got really emotional. You would have thought that he was killing her. And the next day, she had the nerve to apologize with an opening statement, "I'm not a racist." And here we go. This is why our focus as culturally responsive educators has to be less about George Floyd and more about Amy Cooper. The question is, where are the Amy Coopers in our schools? Because in some sense, I would say we're all Amy Coopers. We just have to learn how to admit it. And that's where your work has to be. That's where your leadership has to be. Getting people to admit they are Amy Coopers, right? They leverage race, they leverage culture, but more importantly, they leverage biases, right? That could have detrimental effect as it applies to our students, I would argue. So we know the obvious about George Floyd. I don't think you have to spend too much time there. Where the bulk of the time and the energy has to be is, where are the Amy Coopers in your school? How are you being an Amy Cooper? So, as I said, we want to offer you 4 experiences to move you towards change around racism and the systemic racism in particular. And that is to reflect, acknowledge, call to action, educate. Reflect means you're going to take a deep introspection, starts with you. Acknowledge, silence is complicity. You got to have a conversation. I hope you're thinking about how you're going to talk about the murder of George Floyd with your students when they come back. And that when you do talk with them, you're going to listen more than talk, and you're going to give your students voice. C is a call to action. So we're asking everybody who's a culturally responsive educator to commit to do something individually, as well as have a role in changing something institutionally. In other words, do something. We cannot continue just to have conversations, just to have discussions. We got to do something different. And then lastly, the educate is the 4th experience. And that's where we want to acknowledge that ignorance is not bliss. Knowledge is power. The number 1 correlate to bias thinking is ignorance. So you got to be reading something, you got to be watching something, you got to be listening to something. You have to be discussing something, participating in something, and then rinse and repeat. make a long-term commitment. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get you to have all these four experiences in conjunction, not just one or the other, all four in conjunction. And if you do that, I guarantee you that it will lead you to the next level, the next step that you need to be at. There's a link that should be put into the chat where you can then go to you can go to our bibliography on our webpage, and under each of these categories, we have a list of resources for you. Find the one that worked for you. This is a dynamic page. We'll be updating it constantly, and commit to those four experiences. And it's something that we'll be revisiting throughout the coming year. So we want to also, how will VAB Nation respond? Where it's going to be less talk, more action. We got to be prepared to talk about this with our students. We want to know that the best way to serve our students is still by validating and affirming them, of course, racially. And I say that, of course, tongue in cheek, but our main goal is still focused on culture. And no one has to be perfect in this work. It's actually about being imperfect. Before I go, I want to do a shameless plug for our podcast. It's something I'm really proud of that's slowly forming, developing. It's called Outrageous Love, the podcast. If you haven't heard of it, please subscribe to it. Listen to our latest episode is episode 3 with Dr. Belinda Begay from New Mexico and the Central Consolidated School District in Shiprock. And she gives us her journey to responsiveness in the context of being a Navajo educator and leader. And if you haven't heard about this at all, the first episode is myself, and I'm giving you my journey to responsiveness in fullness as I introduce myself as the first guest for the podcast. So with that said, I'm going to leave you with this quote done by Frederick Douglass, just to point out that our work is long from being done. We cannot be symbolic in this work. We cannot be just surfacey. So the title of this article is "Taking a Knee or Using a New Hashtag Won't Be Enough. We got to do more." And the quote, I'm going to read the last phrase, is by Frederick Douglass, and he's speaking to the abolitionists in the context of the end of the enslavement. And he says that basically nothing is going to change, especially when masters have ceased to be such, not from enlightened moral convictions, but irresistible force, right? And what he's saying there, that if we couldn't get them to do it on out of the kindness of their hearts, moral conviction, then they're going to dig in deeper since it has been done with irresistible force. And I believe that this is the case with where we are right now. You're already beginning to see some people backtracking, right? And so the joke in the community was, whatever we're going to get, we need to get within the next 6 weeks, because after that, it's going to be over, right? And so we see some things kind of falling off. So we have to stay steadfast. We have to persevere. We can't let this happen again. As always, feel free to reach out to me directly at Shiraki@culturesponsive.org.